Dear friends, I'm glad that I have this opportunity to address the participants of the PutinCon conference. It is important that the wide international audience is aware of the criminal nature of the existing regime in Russia. The conference is the major step in this direction. For a number of years, I and my team have been exposing the system of political and economic corruption put in place by Vladimir Putin and his cronies. This system has robbed my fellow Russian citizens of over $1 trillion of revenues from oil and other natural resources. It has put vast part of the national economy in the hands of crooked oligarchs and corrupt state capitalists. It has turned the political system into a rubber stamping machine operated by a close circle of Putin loyalists, and the law enforcement agencies into instruments of political persecution and corporate raiding. It is the system of corruption that has fueled Putin's aggressiveness abroad. Western countries can do much more to fight Russia-related corruption, first of all, within their borders. The legislation enabling this is already in place. I will give you one example. Our latest investigation involved Oleg Deripaska, a Russian tycoon, the majority owner of a large UK-listed company, entertaining a senior Russian government official on his yacht in Norway. This is obviously a criminal offense in the context of the British Bribery Act. We promptly made submissions to the Serious Fraud Office with respect of this case. I hope that the UK government does launch an investigation into this case. However, our previous appeals and submissions to the UK and US agencies have fallen on deaf ears. I hope that PutinCon encourages Western publics, media and governments to take a tougher stance against Russian kleptocrats and their enablers. The fake elections which are coming in Russia in 2 days are opening a new period in Russia's history when the Russian government and its leader will become increasingly fragile. As a famous Russian singer Boris said, "You can lie to people for a long time, but not forever." The history is on our side, on the side of people who would like to see Russia prosperous, fair and democratic. We are continuing our struggle.
As you could see, we fixed the problem. So if they tried to prevent us from listening to Alexei Navalny, they failed. So that's the last panel, and I think we have a daunting task, actually, to give you a hint of optimism after what you heard today. And I hope that my guests at this stage, they will help me just to move in this direction and just to... we will talk about the future, but we'll try not to talk about the future of Putin as much as we talk about the future of Russia. So I introduce my guests. Vladimir Kara-Murza is the Vice Chairman of Open Russia and the Chairman of Boris Nemtsov Foundation for Freedom. Volodya has nearly lost his life twice to poisoning attempts, but I'm happy to say that his body, and most importantly his mind, have refused to quit. Miriam Lanskoy is a Senior Director for Russia and Eurasia at the National Endowment for Democracy. And David Kramer is the Senior Fellow at the Florida International Institute and former US Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights and Labor. So like everyone on this panel, so I dream of democratic Russia, a free Russia, a strong Russia as a part of the family of civilized nations. That's the Russia where I hope to raise my children. So no insult intended to the Upper West Side. There's no guarantee that will happen when Putin falls, but we can guarantee it will never happen while he is in power. So what could bring about that fall? So can the Russian people rise against Vladimir Putin's security forces after 18 years of dictatorship? What about Putin's cronies and supporters? losing confidence in him if he is facing geopolitical defeats. So there are many questions so that we're going to debate now. So, and we are here today not to dream. So I'm joined by these three distinguished experts who have great experience in how democracies rise and fall and rise again. So we all understand here that more than the threat to our country, Russia, Vladimir Putin is also a threat to the rest of the world. So I start with you, Vladimir. So let's talk about the future. So it's, tell us your vision. But remember, we should be positive.
Thank you, Garry. And I want to thank the Human Rights Foundation and Thor Halvorsen for organizing and putting together this conference, and it's a pleasure to be on a panel with such distinguished colleagues. On January 22nd, 1917, Lenin gave a speech to the young Social Democrats of Switzerland at the Volkshaus in Zurich, and he talked about the upcoming changes and the possibility of upheavals in Europe, including what was still the Russian Empire. And he ended that speech by saying that my generation will likely not live to see the decisive battles of that coming revolution. Now, while I think in Lenin's case, many of us wish that his prediction would actually come true, 6 weeks after he made it, the first citywide women's strike broke out in Petrograd, the strike that is generally considered to have been the first firing shot of the February Revolution. The modern history of Russia teaches us that big political changes in our country can start quickly, suddenly, and unexpectedly. I don't think that Vyacheslav Plehve, the Tsarist interior minister, when he boasted in 1904 about his small victorious war on Japan, expected that 1 year later, Russia would be engulfed in a nationwide political strike and that Nicholas II would be forced to grant his subjects civil and political liberties in a national parliament. I think most of us in this room remember that not many people at the beginning of August of 1991 predicted that by the end of the month, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union would no longer exist, and by the end of the year, neither would the Soviet Union itself. I remember those 3 days very well, the 3 days of August, with tanks on the streets of Moscow and with tens of thousands of people, Muscovites, peaceful, unarmed citizens, who went to the streets to stand in the way of those tanks, to stop them. 3 days. A regime that had stood for 74 years went down in 3 days. This is how things can happen in Russia, and no one predicted it. And so next time political change comes to Russia, it may also be sudden, quick, and unexpected. We are told today that Vladimir Putin is omnipotent, that his regime is invincible, that he is highly popular among Russian citizens, and that he has no alternative. We are told that it's ridiculous to even think of, let alone plan for, a post-Putin Russia. As proof of that, we will be told in 2 days' time that Mr. Putin has received 70 or 75 or 80% in the official vote count. We're often reminded that he has 86% support in opinion polls and 86% approval rating. As my good friend Boris Vishnevsky, member of the Legislative Assembly of St. Petersburg, likes to remind, Nicolae Ceausescu had 99% approval standing in opinion polls 1 week before the trial at Kyrgyzstan. And if we want to talk about official election results for those autocratic leaders in the elections that they stood before their fortunes changed, Suharto had 75%, Mubarak had 89%, Ceausescu had 98%. Didn't help them much, apparently. I think manipulated, rigged elections in authoritarian states or opinion polls in societies where many people are afraid to openly state their view about the government for fear of potential consequences are not a very reliable indicator. I think a much better indicator is the behavior of the regimes themselves, and the Putin regime is certainly a case in point. Why would such a popular leader be so afraid of a free election? Why would a government that is based on genuine public support would feel the need to block opposition candidates from the ballot, imprison opponents, beat up and disperse and arrest peaceful demonstrators, censor the media? Perhaps they know better than what Mr. Fyodorov of Tsiom, the state-run polling agency, or Mrs. Pamfilova of the Central Electoral Commission are telling us and them from the screens of state-controlled television channels. We don't know precisely how or precisely when the Putin regime will end, but we know that it will, because nothing is forever. And if we take cues from our own history, it is likely that the next time big political changes start happening in Russia, it will again be quick, sudden, and unexpected. But the downside of that is that nobody's prepared when that change comes. The well-meaning, very well-educated, very intelligent liberals who took charge of Russia in March of 1917 certainly were not prepared. Neither were the reformers in Boris Yeltsin's government in the early 1990s. And Miriam, I think, will speak more about the mistakes that were made in that decade. I mean, it's difficult to be prepared when power just falls on your hands in a matter of days, but we know the mistakes that were made, both in 1917 and in the 1990s, and we know the results and the consequences of those mistakes. So we cannot afford to do that again the next time a window of opportunity comes. We cannot afford not to be ready. So it's not ridiculous to think of and plan for a post-Putin Russia. In fact, it is ridiculous and short-sighted and irresponsible not to. Because when that change starts happening, it will be too late to sit down and start figuring out, okay, what do we do now? We have to make those preparations today. And this, in fact, is the main focus of our work at Open Russia. We're making those preparations for a post-Putin transition, and we're making them in two main ways. The first is by actually working on the substance, the drafts, the proposals for some of the future reforms. And we had several working groups under the auspices of Open Russia, comprising eminent experts in their own fields that have been working on such areas as constitutional reform, energy sector reform, demonopolization of the Russian economy, and others. And the second way that we're doing this is by training and educating and helping to prepare the people who will be participating in that transition, the young generation, the new generation of democratic and civil society activists in Russia. And one of the ways we do that is by running them as candidates and building campaigns in elections all across the country, the fake, truncated, manipulated elections that I've just talked about, but we still feel that we can use them as a training ground. Because even if it's not possible to win, it's still possible to learn the skills of campaigning, to learn how to walk door to door, how to speak at rallies, how to talk to voters, how to publish leaflets in newspapers and organize local activists, and I think they're the wiser for it. It is admittedly difficult to learn the skills of democratic campaigning in an authoritarian system. It was also difficult for Rudolf Kara, a celebrated Soviet pianist. He was an ethnic German, so when the war began in 1941, he was exiled with his family to Kazakhstan and put up somewhere in a wooden barracks in the middle of the steppes, and needless to say, he was not allowed to take a piano with him. So what he did is he took out a plank of wood and a knife, and he carved out a pretend keyboard, and he would practice on it every day so his fingers wouldn't forget. And he did this for 13 years. And in the 50s, he was allowed to return back to Moscow. He became a soloist at the Moscow Philharmonic. He taught at the Moscow Conservatoire. He won the USSR Musical Soloist Competition in 1962. He was one of the most accomplished pianists of his time. And for 13 years, he had practiced on a plank of wood. What we're doing today is that plank of wood. We're using what tools and instruments and opportunities we have to try to prepare those activists for the time when they will be able to do the real thing. And we are already seeing this new generation. This whole conference so far, up to our panel, was dedicated to the official, the Putin side of Russia. The assassinations, the wars, the repression, the election fraud, the corruption, and all the rest of it. And too often that official, that Putin side of Russia, is equated with Russia as a whole. And many people, including many people in the West, fail to see the difference between a country and an authoritarian regime that misrules that country. Well, there's a very different side to Russia. It's, for example, in the people who have been taken to the streets in the tens of thousands this past year, all across Russia, to protest against the corruption and the abuses and the authoritarianism and the sham elections and the sheer arrogance of that same small group of people that has now held power for almost 2 decades. And they've been going out to protest despite the threats and the warnings and the intimidation and the arrests, and despite being told that they could be sacked or expelled from universities. You know, to go out to protest against the government as Russia is not like to go to protest here in New York, where you have freedom of assembly and where you're guarded and protected by police. In Russia, you're beaten up by police if you go to protest against the government. And yet tens of thousands of people did that all across the country, more than 200 towns and cities across 11 time zones, from Kaliningrad to Khabarovsk. And the vast majority of those protesters were young people, university students, high school students, many in their late teens and early 20s, the people who very literally not a figure of speech, very literally represent the future of Russia. They're also the people who were raised, and in many cases now born, under Vladimir Putin, who have watched his face on their television screens every day in their entire lives, who have no memory of any other political reality except Vladimir Putin. And yet it is that generation that is increasingly beginning to say enough. And looking at those protests, I think it becomes a little easier to understand why this regime is so afraid of having a real election. This is an important moment. I think it's a very worrying sign and a very worrying trend for the people who are in the Kremlin. But I think it's a very hopeful and very promising sign for the future of Russia.
Thank you. Thank you, Vladimir. I think Volodymyr reminded us of something that I remember late Boris himself kept repeating, that being anti-Putin doesn't mean being anti-Russian. Being anti-Putin means being pro-Russian. I share this optimism. I would also say that there are many people who are forced to live in exile, and those, many of them, I'm sure, will be more than happy to consider return back to Russia just to build a free country, a free democratic country, using the experience they accumulated while working in the free world. Okay, Miriam, now next to you. So about the experiences of the past, and so what did we do wrong?
Okay, I actually wanted to start with the future and the questions being posed about kind of what some possibilities are. And I wanted to pose 3 questions. And the first is, will Putin be restrained? What are we seeing in the tendencies? Second is democracy possible in Russia? And finally, what is the role of civil society in that? I think there's been a realization of the dangers that the Putin regime presents to, far beyond Russia's borders, and an awareness that greater measures need to be taken to deter him, restrain him. And I would just point to 2 recent events. One is our new national security strategy that talks about the need to compete with global authoritarians, and it specifically names Russia, and it talks about the need for US leadership as a force for good in the world, and it sets out the priority of using US influence to support people who are struggling against authoritarian regimes. Another sort of positive portent is the new comprehensive sanctions law. So our Congress last summer took individual sanctions that had been presidential decrees and turned them into a very comprehensive law that was passed. It had bipartisan support, and it was a nearly unanimous act of Congress that set out a much more comprehensive sanctions regime. And it had a very important section dealing with kleptocracy. It set out the need to analyze how power, corruption are related in Russia, who Putin's cronies are, analyze their relationships, and moreover, determine how and in what form do they pose a threat to key sectors of the US economy. How does the system of kleptocracy in Russia pose a threat to the United States? So this kind of thinking is really very new, and at a governmental level. I mean, I know there are people here who've been talking about these things for 20 years, but as an act of Congress, this is very new, and I think it is important of more such measures to come in the future. So I think Putin's regime will be facing more and more demands for transparency and so forth. Can a democratic Russia emerge? I think we've seen it. We've seen some of these people speak today. They're remarkable people. We've seen Russians on panels today who are, they're smart, they're creative, they're innovative, they're independent, and they're so courageous. And it's not just the people, you saw some of the best today, but there are many of them in Russia, and they're doing really important work. The difference, thank you. The difference with the 1990s, if and when this opening does come, and Vladimir talked about how it could come anytime, it's always unpredictable. There is a much stronger, more resilient, more widespread and diverse civil society in Russia than could have possibly been there in the 1990s when it was just emerging from Soviet rule. We saw the potential for that in 2011, 2012. We saw Putin's middle class, that's what it was considered. We saw them form, it was a new generation and a new social class, very widespread, urban, well-educated young people. They formed new associations. They looked for all kinds of things, volunteer firefighters, cleaning up for mitigating natural disasters, the rights of drivers, all kinds of unions. And then they sought political rights as well. In 2011, 2012, you saw people running for office. You saw opposition candidates winning in small provincial towns. Now, what did it portend? It portended the possibility of real competition and real independent political figures emerging and trying to compete. And we all saw Navalny just now. So this is very much possible. And in fact, the repression, Putin's repression and his aggression is meant to cut off that possibility, the possibility that we all saw. What is the role of civil society? And I think it's very important to mention the things that are going on now and that build towards the future. Outside on the wall of the political prisoners, there are photos, and there's one of them, Titiev. He's the head of Memorial's, Human Rights Society Memorial office in Chechnya, who's under arrest right now on totally fabricated drug charges. For this regime, that's not particularly unusual. What is remarkable is the resilience of Memorial and others in civil society. You heard from Amy Knight about how Anna Politkovskaya was killed for reporting on Chechnya. In 2000, and that was 12 years ago. In 2009, Natalia Estemirova was killed for reporting on Chechnya. And yet, Memorial is still there. They still have their office, and they're reporting on human rights abuses in Chechnya. In the information space, we see amazing opportunities using social media. The ability to produce compelling, truthful content, to come up with good strategies on social media, the things that Navalny, others have done, they get millions of views, tens of millions of views, and they can compete for audience with state media. This is remarkable potential that can be utilized more. Grassroots activism, anti-corruption activism, organizing locally. People learn the values and they learn to overcome apathy, that if they can organize and make some small marginal, it doesn't have to be, it could be something like, again, volunteerism, city parks, protecting the environment. They learn that their organizing, their work can make a difference, even locally and at a small level. And that's important for active citizenship in a democracy. And then finally, Vladimir mentioned this and alluded to it, conceptual foundations for democratic Russia, building now ideas and concepts. How in a democratic Russia, when that opening does come, how can the presidency be contained so it doesn't dominate the rest of the government? How can you protect freedom of speech? How can, when this opening happens, how can we improve upon what happened in the 90s to build stronger institutions that are more resilient and provide a better foundation for democracy? So thank you.
Thank you. David, so you want to mention your latest book?
Sure.
Back, this is Back to Containment. dealing with Putin's Russia.
Yes,
briefly.
And this is not a shameless plug because it's a free book.
Yeah.
And some copies are available outside. But first, let me say, Garry, thanks to you and Thor and Human Rights Foundation for pulling together such an amazing conference. It's always a pleasure and honor for me to be with my friends here on the panel. But I really salute you, and I have to salute this audience who has been here the entire day. It's a fantastic turnout, and that too is inspiring that there are many people who either know already the situation and want to hear it reinforced or are hungry to find out. And so that's a tribute to you and your foundation's efforts, so I really salute you. Everything has already been said, but not everyone has said it, and I'm the last person who hasn't said it. So forgive me if I repeat a few things. And to try to be a little different, though, I'm going to start with Tunisia. Mohamed Bouzizi was a market vendor in Tunisia who had enough. He got sick and tired of being shaken down by corrupt Tunisian authorities, went to protest, got rejected, got beaten up by a cop, and decided that's it, and he set himself on fire and he killed himself. He literally sparked a revolution in Tunisia that then ignited revolutions throughout the Arab world. Some of those revolutions clearly have turned out to be terrible tragedies, particularly in Syria these days. Egypt, not much better. But in Tunisia, there is fragile, nascent movements of democracy. And if we learn nothing else from that experience, we should understand that we never quite know what might be the tipping point. Maybe it's an election in which people protest and say, we're not going to stand for fraud. Maybe it's a market vendor who says, enough is enough. One other lesson I think we should draw from the experience in the Arab world, as long as Ben Ali and Gaddafi and Mubarak and Assad are in power in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and Syria, those countries have zero hope and possibility of moving in a more democratic direction. With their removal from power, there's no guarantee that those countries will move in a democratic direction, but at least there's the possibility. There's the opportunity. And so, as has been said earlier in the day, as long as Vladimir Putin is in power in the Kremlin, Russia has no hope of becoming a democracy as long as he remains there. But if he's gone from the scene, Russia absolutely has a possibility of moving in a more democratic direction. It is biased, prejudiced, racist to argue that Russians are doomed to authoritarian regimes. As has already been said many times up here, it's also an enormous mistake to equate Putin with Russia. There are far too many Russians, as Miriam said, including up here on the stage, in the audience who have spoken before, living in the United States, living in many places, and living in Russia, who want a better future for their country. And for us to equate Putin with Russia, we are consigning the country to an authoritarian future, and that it would be grossly unfair of us to do so. We should also not be driven by a fear of the unknown. We should understand what we already do know, which is that Mr. Putin and his regime are a threat to his own people, he's a threat to his neighbors, he's a threat to the international community, he's a threat to the United States. And if we know that, if we can't learn from that experience and say, well, we better stick with Putin because you never know what might come next might be worse, I don't particularly care for the situation right now. But I'm an American. It's not for me to decide who leads Russia. It's for these guys and others in the audience to do that. But it has also been said, it would be an enormous mistake for us to write off liberal activists, people who want a better future for their country, for their children. It would be an enormous mistake for us to cut off assistance. It was an enormous mistake for the United States to announce that Russia had decided to kick out the U.S. Agency for International Development. Let's not make Mr. Putin's job easier. Let's make sure that we stand for the principles and values that we hold dear and on which this country was founded, and make sure that we stand with those in Russia, show solidarity with those who also want the same thing. As we've seen in, unfortunately, too many countries these days, there has been some real backsliding in democracy. My former organization, Freedom House, has tracked 12 years of decline in political rights and civil liberties around the world, including in some countries that we thought had already passed the hurdle, that had consolidated themselves as democracies. That shows to us that we can never take democracy and freedom and human rights for granted. Russia had some experience, some feel for this in the 90s. I think it was a mistake to have called Russia a democracy in the 90s because it hadn't quite reached that point. And in the process, the 90s, a very difficult time for many Russians, we wound up discrediting the notion of democracy with many Russians and said, if that's what democracy is, I'm not sure I want more of it. So we have to be careful in what we describe things. We have to be careful in not giving up. We have to be careful in supporting those who want a better future, and there are many out there. As Vladimir said, not only why is this regime afraid of free and fair elections, why are they afraid, and we talked about this in Washington a few weeks ago, of people placing flowers at a memorial for Boris Nemtsov? What are they, flowers? They're afraid of a plaque to memorialize a true Russian hero? What kind of secure position is the regime in that it can't even let people remember somebody who really stood for a better future? This is a regime that is terrified by a video by the man we just saw up there, because they're worried that you start pulling on these threads, you never know where it might unravel. So if we learn nothing else, it is to make sure that we stand for those, whether in Russia, in Ukraine, and we have to support Ukraine because success in Ukraine in a democratic, market-oriented fashion rooted in the Euro-Atlantic community is vitally important, not just for Ukraine, it's important for Russia, it's important for Europe, it's important for us. We have to stand with Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians, Moldovans, you name it, the list is endless. And we have to stand for ourselves and for what we believe in and our principles. We have our own house to get in order. We have some cleaning of ourselves to do. But there's no pause button to hit where we ask the world, please wait while we get our house in order. We have to get our own house in order while standing with those who are fighting, struggling, in some cases risking harassment, arrest, intimidation, poisoning, murder. So at a minimum, the least we can do in the West is to stick with our principles, not give up on the country, not assume it's a hopeless situation, because it's not. As Vladimir and others have said, change is coming. Mr. Putin might be there another 6 years, 10 years. He also might be gone tomorrow. Probably not. He probably is going to win the election on Sunday. I'll take bets with anyone in the audience. But that's because it's not an election. It's a coronation. The election was already decided, just as it was September 24th, 2011, when he and Mr. Medvedev announced, guess what, Mr. Putin's coming back as president. The election the following March was simply to affirm the choice that those two, or one, made. So let's stand by our principles, let's do what's right, and let's make sure that we do everything we can to help Russians determine their own future in their own country and not enable the situation of Mr. Putin.
Thank you. Just we have about 15 minutes left, and I would like just to throw a couple of questions just to debate here at stage. Yes, we well know that change in countries like Russia always happened all of a sudden. But if we look at 1904 that you mentioned, or 1917, or 1991, it was not just all of a sudden, because definitely in 04 and 17, in the 20th century, there was a war, a factor of war, and actually losing war. And 1991 also, in my opinion, had a very strong effect of the lost war in Afghanistan. So now the question is, how realistic do you think that is the uprising in Russia without some sort of geopolitical defeat that always accompanied more decisive actions by ordinary citizens? So who wants to start? Okay.
Well, of all the events that I mentioned that happened suddenly, I could have mentioned one more. I didn't, because unfortunately didn't result in what we would have liked it to result in. But that's actually another good illustration of if you're unprepared, then you make mistakes. I think I'm right in saying that if anybody told us, Garry, you or me, that in September of 2011, when David mentioned that castling took place, Putin and Medvedev, if anybody told us that 3 months from now there'll be 100,000 people standing across the river from the Kremlin in Moscow, we would have been very surprised, to say the least. I remember there was a congress of the People's Freedom Party in September, the party of Boris Nemtsov, and he said that in his speech, people were talking about how to approach the so-called election that year. And he said that, unfortunately, the potential for mass protest is not that high. We can get, maybe 4, 5, 6,000 people. And this was the kind of the usual attendance for the marches of dissenters that Garry and others began to lead from 2006. And then suddenly, like this, we had 100,000 people standing across the river from the Kremlin demanding Putin's resignation. And that's another good example of how we were not prepared and how many mistakes were made. And I think many of us now wish we would have done things a little differently back then to take that opportunity. But I think it's also an illustration that there doesn't have to be a war, or there doesn't have to be an economic calamity to cause such mass protests. Because in 2011, the economy was booming. People were doing just fine. There were no wars. That was before Ukraine. That was before Syria. People were just insulted at the way they were treated in this so-called election. They were insulted in having the government wiping its feet over them, telling them, 2 men come out, as David just said, and saying, okay, he'll be president, I'll be prime minister for the next 12 years, goodbye. And, what happened in Ukraine 4 years ago is often referred to as a revolution of dignity. And I think that's the key word, dignity. People in Russia want to feel like citizens of their own country, who actually have a say of who governs them, as opposed to being told this from a television screen. And so the economy was doing just fine, there were no wars, and yet people came out in tens of thousands to protest. And I think it's actually very ironic that, for the last several years, the Putin regime has been sending this message that their biggest fear, the biggest thing they're afraid of, is the sight of mass protests on the streets. I mean, they've been setting up organizations like Nashi to go and try to prevent this kind of scenario. They've been accusing, us, opposition activists and opposition leaders, of plotting with Western governments to have a Maidan scenario. Putin has openly compared Alexei Navalny, the man you just saw on the screen, with Mikhail Saakashvili, the leader of the Rose Revolution in Georgia. He was actually pretty humorous. So when in December he was asked at a press conference of why Navalny is not allowed to run in a presidential election, he didn't refer to this court sentence or whatever the official formal pretext is. He actually said because he's Saakashvili. So he openly admitted that the reason that Navalny is not allowed to run an election is a political reason. So with all the signals they're sending, they're saying that the biggest fear that they have is the sight of people on the streets. And yet, if anybody is preparing that sort of scenario, the kind of scenario that you're asking about, in my view, it's the people who have eliminated elections as a meaningful institution, who have turned parliament into not a place for discussion, as Mr. Grzlov, its own speaker, has described it, that are censoring television, that are keeping the opponents from participating in a regular political process. The best way to prepare for that kind of scenario is to eliminate all normal, peaceful, constitutional ways of changing your government. Again, nothing is forever. And if you eliminate these normal ways of changing your government, you are paving the way for a street scenario.
Yes, I just wanted to make just a comment, because 2011 was a great moment in December. So I think we could do things differently. But still, we remember that even having 120,000 people at the Sakharov Prospect on December 24th, that was not enough, because it was not supported by the provincial Russia, and also there was no split among the elites. Whether we like or not, and of course we didn't like the results of revolution 1905 or 1917, but it was a change. As in 1991, it was a winning change. So in 2011, so we lost, because we couldn't generate enough support, enough momentum, and also the elite, they stayed close to Putin. So again, my question is now, just we move on. So what could be the scenarios that will enable another 2011 moment to become victorious?
Look, I actually think about an earlier period, and I think about that today we're in a kind of stagnation, that this regime, it's terribly corrupt, it's inefficient, some of the best minds are leaving, there's capital flight, And if you compare it, if you think about kind of cycles of Russian history and you think about stagnation, and what came next was perestroika. And this regime, through its own incompetence, and may sort of permit some limited reforms that can then be picked up and expanded by people who are much more authentic Democrats. And I think about those types of scenarios more than about street action as a kind of realistic possibility. I know that it's hard to imagine a thaw or a top-down kind of reform, but the economy is not growing. The same kinds of rot in the system as existed in the Soviet Union are also beginning to be felt. And I just wanted to comment on your about wars and the pains that the regime is going to hide its losses in Ukraine and to hide its losses in Syria. They're clearly aware that these wars might not be popular, that people may not be wanting to pay this kind of price for what they're doing. And again, remarkable reporting by Russian journalists, both about Ukraine and most recently about Syria and the use of mercenaries in Syria. Absolutely remarkable by local Russian journalists from Fontanka and others.
David, just going back to the policy of containment, because it's, as Miriam just mentioned, the mid-'80s. So what we saw is that the regime was loosening up. So Gorbachev tried reforms. So today we see the opposite trend. They are just, the laws are just, turning into most draconian versions, and this regime shows no sign of liberalization. So, can we say that it's partially because of total lack of pressure from the outside world, and it's more like an appeasement that encouraged Putin just to become more aggressive abroad and also more draconian at home? So what lessons we could learn from the 80s, for instance, applying them today, if any?
Well, I certainly, and I know you're not either, I wouldn't compare Gorbachev to Putin by any means.
No, we're talking about history.
Right, and so you did have a leader who at least was trying to launch an openness policy, restructuring, but not to do away with the communist system, but to reform it. And now you have someone who doesn't care about reform of the current system. He, in a way, has become a hostage to his own system. He can't escape it because it is such an authoritarian, kleptocratic regime. And his interest and the circle around him, their interest is simply to maintain power at any cost. We enable them by doing that, by not applying enough pressure. And Mike Carpenter ran through a list of things earlier on what we can do, including sending more energy to Europe. Hitting them on energy will certainly hurt. But it is unconscionable that so many people affiliated with the regime have property in this country, in Europe, send their kids, their mistresses, you name it, and we don't do much of anything about it. We need to play offense. And it's not to determine Russia's future for Russia. It is to make sure that we are not complicit with the current regime. That's the least we can do. And I think, unlike the 80s, when there were some common interests, and I think Gorbachev slowly over time was trying to reduce the gap in values. I don't want to exaggerate that. We have zero common ground on values today with the current regime. And I would say we're moving toward zero interest, common interest with the current regime. If what happened in Syria a few weeks ago is true, however many deaths of Russian mercenaries, that is a serious problem, where Russian and US forces might actually come into a direct conflict, even if they're mercenaries, not formal Russian military forces. The situation in Ukraine has been talked about before. We have to stand up and put Putin and company on their heels so that they are wondering what we might do next instead of having us wonder, what is he going to do next?
Good. Thank you. We have a few minutes left, but I should probably I could add a bit of time. So, because let's again end this conversation on a positive note. Let's talk about the future of Russia. So, it happened. It has happened. one or another. Uprising in Moscow, pressure from the free world, you name it. So we're not now talking about it. Putin has gone. So what's happened to him, just again, it's not of our concern. I say there's always bad news and good news about Putin's departure. The bad news, we don't know when and how it happens. The good news, he also doesn't know. Now, what is to be done in Russia? So that's considering our negative experience during the World War I and also during the tumultuous 90s. So should we talk about dramatic changes in Russian political structure? So moving from presidential republic to parliamentary republic. So what about federalization? So should we actually have the reconciliation commission? So to look at the crimes of Putin's regime and also the crimes of communist regime. So again, we don't have much time. Obviously, that's a debate for hours and hours and for days, and there's for many books to be written, volumes. But just, let's just ignore the clock. So just, give your, why not playing chess? So, and just give this, again, a hint of optimism to those who are listening to us. So what will be done in this new Russia to make sure that it will be just not new, not Russia without Putin, which is an important step forward, but also free and democratic Russia?
I think one of the biggest mistakes that were made in the 90s is there was no proper accounting of the past. There was no proper accounting for the crimes of the past regime. It was just a big debate in the early 1990s. And it was a clear window of opportunity. I mean, I remember the surveys at the time. The majority of Russians, according to opinion polls, which were real back then, were in favor of, for example, limiting former operatives of the communist regime or the KGB from occupying positions of power, but this was never done. The archives were very briefly opened, but then they were shut again. There were several initiatives on illustrations introduced in the Russian parliament, one of them by Galina Starovoytova, a member of parliament from St. Petersburg, one of the leaders of the Russian democratic movement. They were all blocked, they were all turned down, and the phrase that was very popular at the time is, we don't want to have a witch hunt. We don't want to have a witch hunt. Well, as the more far-sighted people like Starovoytova, like Bukovsky, like others were saying, at the time, if we don't hunt the witches will come back to hunt us. And this is precisely what happened. And I think that is one of the most important lessons of the 1990s, that you cannot turn a page and build something new unless you take account of the crimes committed by the former regime. That is certainly one lesson we have to learn, in my view, for the future. And the second point I'd make is I think it's very important to emphasize that our goal is not to just change the person at the top. Our goal is to change the system. Yeah. We do not want to replace Putin with Navalny or Khodorkovsky or anybody else. That's not the point. We don't want to replace a bad czar with a quote-unquote good czar. There's no such thing as a good czar. We want there not to be a czar in Russia. And I think I can say with confidence that it hasn't worked out well, at least in our country, when one person held all the levers of power. It doesn't end well. And so when I mentioned earlier that one of the projects that Open Russia was working on is a project for constitutional reform, and there was, and the conclusions in that report were that Russia should definitely move, and I think that's actually, it goes beyond what we are doing, and there's a growing consensus in the opposition movement that whatever comes after Putin must be a much more balanced system, either a pure parliamentary system or at least a mixed presidential parliamentary system, not a one-man, executive vertical of power that exists today. I mean, there have been many studies done over the years showing that parliamentary systems are much more conducive to maintaining democracy than presidential ones. And I think it's enough to illustrate this point is to say that there are only 2 countries in Europe today where the government is not appointed by and responsible to parliamentary majority. That's Russia and Belarus. And I think that's all that needs to be said on the subject. So changing the system, not just the person at the top, is a very important principle.
I guess in this country, many also concerned about excessive presidential powers today. Okay.
But we as Russians, we're not meddling into U.S. domestic politics.
No. Well, just stating the fact.
Right.
I think so. I would agree with the point about lustration, about looking into the past and holding people accountable for what has happened, for the kinds of crimes that have been committed, and also for the importance of drafting constitutions, basic laws, and so forth. And some of that work is being done. There are experts, thinkers, thinking through what would be a better institutional system. But in the end, that's a document. And in the 1990s, Russian constitution was pretty good. There was actually not such a bad constitution. Maybe the president was too strong. It could have here and there. What's important is for it to be fulfilled, for the government to observe its own laws, and for citizens to be able to hold the government accountable. And how to make that happen, and I think that one of the things missing in the 1990s is that people retreated into their personal lives. Life was very difficult. It was a difficult economic time, and people were not used to taking responsibility for public life, for what's happening in the country. It was very new, and a lot of kind of good democratically minded people did not step into politics. They didn't step into the public sphere and into whether civil society or more explicitly political life. And one of the things that needs to be different is the understanding that laws and constitution and all of these things, there needs to be a citizenry holding the government accountable, and civil society that will be there to follow through on those promises. So that's one of the key ingredients and one of the things that was missing in the 90s. And I think people also were just, there were tactical mistakes made by liberals and reformers, and there was very little political experience. People failed to make alliances. They came out of a kind of oppositional dissident mindset where it was very difficult to compromise, even when, and frankly, we see this in opposition politics in Russia still, and in many other places, where it's personality driven instead of being policy driven. And I think the need to form durable coalitions around values and policies is one of the key factors as well.
Thank you.
I would start by echoing diminution in power in one person or in one position is absolutely critical. I think where we have seen some success in transitions is a move toward a parliamentary system. It's certainly not perfect, and there's even the potential for rollback in those systems. But a diminution in power is absolutely critical. Transparency is another. Putin's greatest export is corruption. And in order to export it, by the way, we import it. So shame on us. But Russians should demand transparency so that they know where their money is going. I think that's essential. And then to echo civil society, along with civil society is a free press, a diverse media, which is a critical check and balance. And it's why it pains me so much to hear in this country the demonization of journalists, of the media, because what may be verbal attacks now are being interpreted in Russia, not that they need encouragement under the Putin regime, but in the Philippines and Egypt and elsewhere, of physical attacks there. And so we have to make sure that we understand what we say and do here is being watched very carefully overseas. And that's why I think supporting a free press in Russia, diverse media, civil society, checks and balances, transparency, I would hope that those are causes that most Russians could rally around.
Thank you. I hope that after listening to this extraordinary panel, so you will not leave this building depressed. So there is a future, and there is a future for Russia. And I hope there's no future for Vladimir Putin. And it will depend on all of us, because we know that it would be much easier 15 years ago, or 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago to stop him. And every day is simply pushing the price up. But today I think you heard many stories from people who were engaged in these battles in different fronts. And it will help you to understand the true nature of Putin's regime. And you'll spread the word. And you will keep following Human Rights Foundation, our events. So thank you very much for coming here and inspiring all of us today. Thank you.